All right, I think we're live. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, panelists. I'll just quickly introduce everybody, launch into a short presentation, and then hand over to panelists for questions. Going alphabetically, Abhijit Singh, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Stockholm. He's done a lot of research work in India on education. Dr. Ben Piper, Senior Director at RTI International. He's led many large-scale foundational literacy and numeracy programs in Africa, done a lot of research around them. Very pleased to have you here, Ben. And last but certainly not least, Sandhya Rani ma'am, who used to be Commissioner Education in Andhra Pradesh, currently is, unfortunately for education, in the postal services. But very, very pleased to have you here, ma'am. It would be great to have your perspective. Yeah. To start off, I'm cutting into our panelists' time to launch a report that CSF has been working on. I hope this is visible to everybody. The general idea here, of course, is that that we have so many children in India's schools. It's the largest school system in the world, but we really don't do a good job of equipping children with foundational skills. And the reason this matters is that these foundational skills then become very important for children to learn later in life, in school and in life. And the children who get left behind early tend to stay behind early, right? And we can see that independent estimates by USR estimate that as many as 80% of grade 3 students cannot read even a grade 2 text in India. So we dug into why this should be the case, right? And our report does an extensive literature review as well as a lot of primary diagnostics that covered 5 states, 660 stakeholders. And to try and make sense of all of this data and information, obviously, we need some kind of framework. And that's what we're looking at here. We're categorizing all of the issues and findings that we came across into what we see in the classroom, which we think of as symptoms, what drives these symptoms in the managerial and administrative systems, and what underlies these issues further at the structural or root cause level. At the classroom level, we found that over 57% of students, when they enter school, are not ready for what the curriculum expects them to be ready for. And this mismatch just continues over time. Right? There is very limited instructional time because a lot of it is lost because of teacher and student absenteeism, because of duties that are assigned to teachers that go beyond their teaching duties, and the fact that 63% of classrooms in India are multi-grade. So one teacher is handling many different grades and they have to split their time across these grades. And when they do teach kids, 70% of their time ends up being spent on very traditional lecture-based teaching methods and rote pedagogy, which is not very effective in imparting skills to kids. At the managerial level, we find that in terms of goals, right? So the entire system is not very aligned. Everyone has a learning framework that's been created at the background, but when we actually speak to stakeholders, we find that nobody actually echoes the same goal, right? No one is saying, this is what we want to achieve. And you can't hear the same statement from more than one person. Everyone has different ideas. And the academic support that they get in terms of teaching, learning material, training, the way parents are engaged is very ineffective. Similarly, in terms of monitoring, we found, and this is very pertinent for this data panel that we have, right, on the importance of data, we found that 80% of indicators in school monitoring tools are actually related to inputs and infrastructure. And as many as 62% of the cluster resource coordinators and head teachers felt that monitoring really is just about data gathering, right? It's not about helping people improve. And what data does get gathered is actually not very reliable, and Abhijit's studies actually provide great evidence, and those are the ones that we cite here, that learning levels that get reported via the state system are actually vastly inflated. And even the data that is collected is very rarely discussed for improvement. Now, what are the structural causes of this, right? And I'll focus just very quickly on points 3 and 4 here. The main reason is that learning actually is invisible, especially when you compare it to schools, teachers being present in schools, etc. Right? So our system then just focuses on these things. They focus on having these inputs in place and making sure that parents are aware of them. And this focus on inputs has resulted in lots and lots of small schools which are very inefficient and very difficult to run properly. There's MGML, a whole host of issues, right? So, and this makes it difficult to capacitate our actors appropriately. It increases our spending to extreme amounts. So, in the last sort of 10 to 12 years, real expenditure on education per child has actually almost tripled, right? Where learning outcomes have actually been going down over this time. So the money that we spend on education, and we spend quite a bit, is not really translating into learning. So what do we do about this, right? All of this is very bad news. And a lot of this actually comes from Ben's work, what you're seeing here. The large-scale programs that Ben has helped run in Africa, and the idea is that siloed interventions don't tend to help, right? That interventions have to be very tightly knit together. They have to align everybody on realistic, measurable goals. These people have to get support for these goals, and they have to be monitored on, again, progress towards these goals. To sustain learning over time, obviously, we need to cover what I was saying, that we want to make learning visible, and that we need to build system capacity to do all of these things over time, right? So that was a very, very rushed version of the systemic drivers of FLN outcomes in India report, which we are launching today. Somebody will put up links to this report in the chat box. Now, I think having covered what the issues are, I'll move on to a much more focused angle of what the issues are related to data specifically, and then hand over to our panel to try and discuss how can these issues with data be addressed, but also how can data be leveraged to try and fix many of these other things that we spoke about, and to drive better and better learning outcomes for India's children. So on data specifically, we found that at the classroom level, there is very little focus on actually testing for competencies and skills. And assessments are not really used by teachers to provide additional support to lagging students. And where we found continuous and comprehensive evaluation, which the RT requires all schools to do, but this doesn't really happen. But where it does happen, it's much more focused on, again, compliance and documentation, rather than actually trying to use it to impact learning. At the managerial level, we find, again, repeating myself, 80% of indicators are focused on compliance. The data is extremely unreliable and very rarely used. At the structural level, capacity is quite limited, so measuring with precision what learning outcomes are and using them is quite difficult. And one aspect that we haven't touched on, but I think is very, very critical on this aspect of data, is that the processes often involve misaligned incentives, in the sense that nobody in the system really has good incentives to be collecting appropriate data or collecting reliable data. Yeah. So these are sort of the issues on data. We just switch over to questions. We'll start with Ben. Ben, what are the data points that really low capacity education systems should be collecting, and how can they use them to improve learning?
Thanks so much, Rahul, and it's really a pleasure to be with you today and with this great panel. Looking forward to hearing your comments. Listen, when it comes to thinking about how to use data to improve learning, I think you actually have to start on the pedagogical side, not the data side, because you need a strong pedagogical instructional improvement system, ideally using structured materials with student books and teachers' guides. And then the data system is around sharing the distribution and implementation of that program. But one of the points I want to make from the outset is you need to start with the teaching. You need to start with the pedagogy, start with the instruction. One thing I'm worried about right now is that some of the push on data and continuous assessment becomes data for data's sake. I think Rahul, your report makes clear that so much of this data is about compliance rather than about pedagogical change and about classroom implementation. The data that I'm talking about is about data targeted to help improve implementation and to help the system respond to challenges. So that's number one, you need a strong pedagogical system. Number two, the purpose of the data. And the purpose of sharing that data is to improve learning by creating the incentive structure for teachers in typical rural schools to implement this improved pedagogical FLN, Foundational Literacy Numeracy program, on a daily basis. Fundamental thing that the data system is in place to get the message down from the prime minister, down from the state, all the way down into that rural school classroom, that someone cares whether or not I'm teaching this program and whether I'm teaching it well, and that someone is actually coming to my classroom to observe them do this program. That creates a powerful signal that incentivizes and increases the likelihood that this teacher in the rural school will be able to teach and focus on teaching more effectively. So that's number two. There's a real purpose for this data to create this incentive structure. The third point I'd make is that the data itself can help the system orient its instructional support resources. Across the various states in India, I understand that there are coaches and mentors of various designs and various implementation structures, but those are typically administrative officers who have a variety of other tasks that the system wants them to do. So the purpose of this data structure is to create the incentives for those officers who support the coaches and mentors to make the administrative decision that is valuable to have that coach and have that mentor go actually down into the classroom and observe a lesson and give feedback to a teacher. What we are dealing with is a limited resource of these mentors and coaches' time. And so the data system where you are able to see how often these coaches and mentors are making classroom observations, the point of that is to help push the decision-making of that officer and that officer's boss that it's valuable to go to the school and it's valuable to go down to the lowest level. In addition, the idea of having an overall national level data or state level data system observing FLN implementation is so that a district level leader or a state level leader will be able to identify what districts or blocks are not implementing at all or not implementing well. I actually would like to say this, that much of what distinguishes effective programs is that ineffective programs don't find out till Dr. Abhijit Singh or somebody else comes and does the final evaluation and tells you that, by the way, in this district, nobody ever implemented the program, right? So Abhijit's research is going to be high quality and rigorous, and we're very confident that the answer is zero. But can't we have a system that would tell us that same message 1 month into implementation, that, okay, we have a real problem here. And by the way, we should expect it. In my experience, large-scale implementation in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, there are many programs that are designed well. You do a good training, you have the prime minister or the president announce it, but a decent percentage, 30 to 50% of teachers never begin implementation. So how quickly can you identify where that initial implementation didn't begin, and how can you use the data to kind of communicate that, yes, actually, we are serious. We want you to implement. So number four, listen, the ICT people, and there are many people on this panel, I would bet, who are ICT experts. They will tell you all the millions of data points that your data system can answer. There are I've seen across the countries that we're supporting several different designs that are collecting literally hundreds of data points across schools. But I think that program leaders need to be judicious about which data points matter the most. And instead of having an overwhelming amount of data that actually isn't used at all, you can collect a lot of data, but what are the data you share? We have national level or state level dashboards in a lot of the countries we work on, and you want to have the right data, a few data points that drive decision making shared at those levels. So example, here are mine. Number one, I want to know what portion of coaches and mentors are visiting schools on a regular basis, because I want the district level leaders and state level leaders to say, okay, you in this part of Andhra Pradesh, you need to go visit, and I want to have that information fast. What portion of coaches are visiting schools regularly? That's number one. Number two, what portion of teachers have been observed on a regular basis? You want to know, are you missing your rural schools? Are you missing one particular district? You want to know what portion of teachers have been observed. Number three, I want to know what portion of teachers are actually on track with the program. It's a very simple way of doing this. Many of our programs have kind of a set of lessons. What lesson are they on? It is now August 14th. What lesson is the teacher who's teaching on August 14th on? Are they on lesson 100? Or are they on lesson 40? You will learn a lot about implementation based on what lesson they're on. How long was the lesson? That's a fifth one. I like to know there's a very big difference between a 10-minute, you're giving us, Rahul, 10 minutes to talk. There's a big difference between a 10-minute lesson and a 30-minute lesson. We want to see whether the teacher is teaching the full lesson and actually giving the instructional time that's needed. How closely did the teacher follow the students? And here's a critical one. What are the learning outcomes, the assessment results of the 3 to 5 children that coach who observed the lesson at the end of the lesson pulled 3 kids and read with them or did a quick math assessment? What are the outcomes of the kids, not for that particular lesson, but an aggregate over time? And are we seeing over time increases? Are we seeing comparisons that make sense if the program is being implemented? I gave you 5 key measures, 5 or 6. You can do all the data collection you want, but those are the sort of things I would like to have in the minds, in the forefronts of the minds of district level leaders and people who are making decisions about allocation of time. So my 5th big point is that let's distinguish between assessment in the system, which is this kind of coaching, testing, observation data, and assessment in the classroom. So good pedagogy includes assessment-informed instruction. I need to know whether or not my kids are learning. When I was a teacher, I taught 4th grade. When I would give a lesson, I would let the children leave. They would go to recess or to lunch. I would give them an exit ticket. I would give to be able to see whether or not they learned. So as they walked out, I would have a quick 2 questions that they would hand me. As they're going off for lunch, I would just quickly read, okay, what portion of children are understanding my lesson? Those sort of simple continuous assessment measures are things that teachers should be supported to do, but are not the same at these kind of system level diagnostic supervision structures. 6th point, continuous assessment, this kind of data system can be effective, but here's a really important point. It can be actually counterproductive if done badly. I think you might have experience with highly burdensome continuous assessment data functions that actually become very distracting for teachers. We need to instead identify the light touch methods that teachers can use to identify how kids are doing. I actually love the systems work that I've learned about from India, where they quickly measure whether children are at the letter, word, story, or comprehension level so a teacher could target their instruction. But I would not recommend making the frequency of these continuous assessments be too much. I've seen well-meaning people create continuous assessment tasks for teachers where every week they have to assess all 100 of their kids on a different metric. It just becomes burdensome for teachers and actually pushes out some of the pedagogical things that matter more. So how do you get the pacing of this continuous assessment data at the classroom level to be right so it's not counterproductive and turns the teachers off? Quick tests, quick measures on a monthly basis rather than a weekly basis. I've actually seen that go quite badly. I'm wrapping up here, Rahul, don't worry. Our estimates, 2 last points. Our estimates suggest that learning loss has been substantial. And if you care what I think, the main point I would say that needs to happen to improve learning outcomes in 2021, 2022, 2023, as we're dealing with substantial learning loss, is 1, a system that supports teachers to teach a structured pedagogy program. That means lessons every day, kids with books, 30 to 40 minutes of core instruction on local language and second language every single day. That's part of it. The second part is combining that with a catch-up program that uses teaching at the right level, methods, in ability groupings, potentially in the afternoon or before lunch. That combination of instructional improvement is what I would recommend as the core thing we need to help kids deal with learning loss and fundamentally to help reduce the inequities we see across these countries and contexts we care so much. Last point, we actually also have some new resources on this idea of assessment-informed instruction that will be released in the next couple of weeks. And we have an upcoming webinar talking about how to use data in the system in these ways. Thank you so much, and look forward to the comments of the rest of the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. I think very insightful on what a good data system needs to have, right? Abhijit, I'll turn to you now for the other end of the spectrum, right? What do our data systems have and why? Just your view on what's not going.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for organizing this, Rahul. I think I'm just going to follow on from what Ben was saying. I think we're at a particular moment in India right now that essentially across all tiers of government, there is some version of agreement that we should be measuring learning outcomes. And that's relatively new, right? I mean, like 10 years ago, that wasn't that the idea that you would want to be testing children much before the key stages of class 10 and class 12. I mean, that's relatively new. There's already in a whole number of states, Andhra Pradesh being one, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, a number of states have essentially instituted census-based assessments that test every kid in at least the public schooling system, and in some states, Andhra Pradesh, also in the private schooling system, right? So I mean, like we now talking hundreds of millions of kids who are sitting these assessments, and I think we're at the point that we really need to ask, well, exactly why are we doing this? Can we trust what we get out of this information? And how would we set up structures to make the information reliable if that's what we want? And assuming we had reliable information, how would you use it? Right? So, I mean, in some senses, I think of a minimum level of reliability as a core prerequisite for any plans of how you would ever use it for accountability, for informing parents and the like. And I think we're actually quite dramatically stuck at that first point. So I've now looked at this in a couple of states. The first of which was Madhya Pradesh, which was a state that's actually a very good example to look at because they've been doing this for a long time, right? So they started in 2011, where they started with something that's a national best practice, apparently, which is that they have an annual standardized exam. They send these question papers from the center. It's on radio. It's low stakes. It's meant to be diagnostic. It's called Pratibha Parv. So for Ben's benefit, I mean that's sort of like a day of talent or a festival of talent, depending on exactly how you want to translate it. But the entire idea is that you want to show what students can do. And I did a very simple audit there, which is that you look at the official data, and at the school level, you can find that, okay, Ben was reported to have answered these questions correctly. And then you just go and ask those students that exact question again in exactly the same format. And the levels of achievement are exaggerated by about a factor of 2, right? So things that Ben is things that 70% of kids are reported to have gotten right. I mean, we go and ask it, it's about 30-35%. And you can see that a lot of this is coming out of things like copying, because in some grades, you have multiple question paper sets and you send the answer scripts elsewhere for grading. And this difference is like reduced by half, right? So clearly, even at scale, even in settings with low accountability, they're relatively simple things that the state is able to do and reduce the magnitude of the problem, right? And then we'd found like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and then, was just silently, privately depressed for a while. And then I think one version of trying to figure out how you would ever scale up versions of doing this was to try and see, well, are there ways of administering these assessments that don't impose additional burden on teachers, that don't rely on some version of having hundreds and thousands of external monitors that you can send around, and would still work in the context of children giving assessments potentially in unfamiliar formats, right? So where we tried that out, and actually both Sandhya ma'am and Rahul know far more about the program than me, because they were the ones who were helping, who were designing, authorizing, implementing all of that. Was that in one entire district in Andhra Pradesh, in Prakasham, all kids in grade 4 or like all schools which had grade 4 were included in assessments. And in about 2/3 of them, the assessment was done on tablets, which basically showed you one question at a time, which changed the question order sets, and which make it kind of hard to copy from each other. Right? I mean, that's fundamentally what it's doing, and it's not asking teachers to grade anything extra. Right? So that's kind of what gets some amount of buy-in. And at a scale of, I mean, the tablet assessments happen in about 1,700 schools. So even at that kind of scale, implemented entirely with the state machinery, we found very little evidence of cheating in the tablet assessments. And in the other third, which were randomized and sent out on paper with external grading, with multiple sets, you're seeing differences not as stark as in MP, but still like about a 20 percentage point difference. Right? So that's the difference between 60% of kids being able to answer a particular question and 80%, 82%, right? So, and you can see this at individual items, individual students, we do a retest. So all of that being together. So just in terms of like, where do I think we're headed on this, right? I mean, like what is it that we would want to think about? Well, I think there's 2 or 3 things, right? So one set of issues is about how we administer tests. And I think this is one of those areas where it's not as if the problems are completely unknown. So I think everyone in the system knows that if you do not have proctoring, you will have a degree of copying. If you start putting stakes, you will have problems of grade inflation. To the extent that, we particularly care about specific grades, I think if you're doing it on paper, sending the answer script somewhere else is useful, right? Having multiple sets is useful. This is one of the few areas where I think it's also increasingly possible to think of some version of technology-based assessments. Before we did the work in AP, I would have given it about a 50-50 chance of us being able to implement it, because I frankly was just not sure that class 4 students who have never answered a maths question on a tablet would be able to engage with the format. Okay, so that was half of the reason why when CSF asked me to be involved, I was like, okay, guys, I know you think this will work, but I would rather test it and see before we go with any versions of scaling things up across the state. And that seems to have worked. Like that really seems to have worked. So I think like with reasonable design, that's doable. And because this doesn't require having tablets for every student or even tablets for every school, because you can do this in a staggered manner, this works out in sort of the cost envelopes that are doable within current systems, right? So I think that's really worth trying out. As Sandhya ma'am knows, we were at the cusp of trying to do this larger in AP, and then stuff happens as it does in all states. So I think that's one set of how we administer tests. The next set of things is, well, how do we set up our system to do what Ben was saying we should, which is how do we figure out, not ex post when we go and do like large audits, that okay, this particular round of data can be trusted or not, right? So I mean, like, not only do you need to know about it in the system in general, but you want to know about any program, and that includes assessment programs, that this time this really blew up, right? Or it blew up in this district, or it blew up in these types of schools, or here are the comparisons that we really shouldn't be making, right? And I think there's a few different things here. One is that there is no version of the world where you can go and audit everyone, right? So I managed to go back and do this in like 100 schools, but let's face it, large-scale program implementation is a completely different order of magnitude of solving this problem. So you end up in this world where, who will audit the auditors, and then it's like a rabbit hole that you go down, right? I think what is important is to realize that it is possible to figure out the kind of manpower required to retest like 3%, 5% of schools, and that's the kind of thing that we should be doing in general as a sense check, not for any individual school, but for the system as a whole, right? Like, do we trust this information if we're going to make large-scale decisions on this? If we're going to distribute report cards to parents saying these are good schools, these are bad schools, we need to be sure that it's not just that the good schools didn't proctor their exams, right? There was no invigilator there. There is also another thing that I think we learned out of the AP study, which was that actually it turns out that if you have access to the item level information, you can look at suspicious patterns, and that information correlates almost exactly at the school level with what we got out of audits. Okay, and the reason that I mention this is the following, that to my knowledge, other than the stuff that we've been doing in AP, this version of sort of looking for suspicious patterns, trying to do this at scale, just hasn't, for whatever reasons, made it into the policy table in India, right? So item level information is never available for analysis ever across the board. So I mean, AP was an exception, and I think we're missing a trick there, right? So to the extent that I can think of large administrative systems for checking data integrity, those typically look at some version of internal consistency of response patterns, right? So I mean, this is what Italy does, this is what Mexico does, this is what Indonesia does, and I think also the risks of like privacy loss, if the data are properly anonymized, of just letting it out are very low, right? So I mean, in contrast to the kind of information that across the government we're happy to put online, this is relatively low stakes, and it solves two issues. I mean, one is that this is how you build trust in assessments. Like at this point, anytime somebody mentions a new state to me, that I have no experience of their exams, my first question is typically, oh, but do you trust your assessment? And then you have to effectively take somebody's word for it. Whereas it's a lot easier when you can verify, right? I mean, that's one. The other is that, frankly, I mean, we lack analytical capacities, as in data analytics type of capacities in most states. So the moment you start making data available, it allows for organizations to have one or two people who effectively can do the same exercise across multiple states. So it's not, so I mean, in the long run, I think we really do want all departments of education to have that capability, but that's a 10-year project, right? So what do you do from now until 10 years in the future that everyone's comfortable with their own data sets? I think some version of making that available is important. Last bit, and then I'll be done, and I think that's exactly time, is just to go back to Ben's point. I mean, how exactly do we think we're going to use this information? And I think there's multiple bits there, right? And typically the one that we end up talking about the most is how to use it in the classroom and how to use it for sort of monitoring, aligning the system. I think there are at least a couple of other things where having high quality system level assessments ends up being a huge deal, right? One is it establishes a common set of facts. I mean, there is something quite sad about the fact that, 15 years after we started talking about learning standards, we basically only rely on USER as a common metric that tells us across the country, here is roughly what learning levels look like. And we do this only in rural areas, and we still have very little idea of what urban learning looks like. Right? And part of that is that we lack a common metric that we trust. Right? So there's a huge deal to be said about establishing a common set of facts. That also relates to ways of diagnosing, in the way that Ben was saying, stuff that's working and stuff that's not. Right? So not everything needs a large RCT. Sometimes, I mean, the fact that if you had a metric you trusted, and guys, everything looks exactly as it did last year, I'm kind of willing to believe that nothing shifted, right? Or if things are going down, I'm kind of willing to believe that nothing shifted. And the advantage of knowing something with 80% accuracy 3 years earlier versus perfectly correctly 3 years later is huge in implementation. And we just don't have those feedback mechanisms because we don't have outcomes that we trust, right? So we can track enrollment well, and that's not the margin we need interventions on at the moment, like not in primary school. So yeah, and that's that.
Yeah, I'm not even sure we can trust the enrollment data, but that's a question for another time. Sandhya ma'am, you've heard Ben on what a good system might look like, Bijit on what our system might look like. From you, I mean, as someone who's run these systems, what's your perspective on what it would take to use data to drive learning? and governance both, right? Yeah. You're on mute, ma'am. Sorry.
Thank you, Rahul, and wonderful hearing to Ben and Abhijit. Yeah, as an administrator and a concerned citizen about what's happening and where this huge learning crisis is coming from, absolutely, I couldn't disagree with anything that Ben or Abhijit said. But one issue that I would really like to flag is the scale. And we all know when you're actually scaling it, there is a huge amount of so many caveats that we need to work around, work with. And as an administrator, I would look for solutions there. While we may debate about census data or a quality sample data and how we arrive at what are the actual findings and how they will support decision making, from my experience, I found that absolutely no doubt that working with data really gives a typical administrator at whichever level, commissioner, district level, sub-district level, or even school level, data is absolutely critical. And obviously, the more quality it has, better integrated it is, more user-friendly the dashboards are, and more focused on learning outcomes. These are the kind of things that we struggle to put in place, and we attempted to some extent in Andhra Pradesh. While looking at learning outcomes, largely diagnostic, as pointed out by Ben, we haven't really even arrived at pedagogy level and in classroom coaching and observing and giving feedback. We were still working with larger databases, but actually putting them to much better use. I think that's where we attempted in Andhra Pradesh, and of course tried. That helped us actually bring one focus onto learning outcomes. One was generally doing all operations and then doing the teaching, learning, completing syllabus. I mean, that's how the whole trip was going on. To some extent, NAS and regular state level assessments, diagnostic studies, even census-based study we undertook in 2015 for those grades that were not covered in the National Assessment Survey. It all helped us bring all the stakeholders on the importance of learning outcomes. And I think it took a lot of effort. One, two, building awareness among them on how do we use this data, what kind of dashboards are useful for us, and putting in system a portal where we could actually collect and track CCE performance for whatever good, how much ever fudging happened. We collected it from class 6 to class 10 for private school and for government schools. The initial purpose was just to track how the assessments are, identify what are the hard spots, how do we kind of make that informed teacher training. Majorly initiatives were in government schools. But there were other flip sides that when another policy impacted on this, for instance, we said that certain performance, say 20% of performance in class 8 and 9 will be factored into class 10 internal assessment and overall class 10 performance. So we found that there was a certain amount of fudging being done in private schools, and the administrative system was not strong enough, capable enough to actually arrest that and or even reduce the impact of it. So you see 1 year, the 10 by 10 GPA performance of private schools really skyrocketed compared to the government schools because there was some amount of monitoring happening within the government school system. So we needed to change the larger policy. But coming back, yes, how did it help in terms of driving learning outcomes? Even these diagnostic tools, we could identify what were those low performing districts. We identified 5 of them where we could take up in partnership mode with Pratham, the Teaching at Right Levels program for all primary sections. That actually, and continuous monitoring, baseline, midline and endline actually helped where the students were moving. It built a lot of capacities for the teachers, I think more than 7,000-8,000 teachers, and it definitely showed positive impact on learning outcomes. Second, what some of the pilots like TAB, technology-driven pilots that we undertook in Prakasham district and which we wanted to scale, also showed us the way forward on what is possible and not as at this cost that we were imagining. It was almost doable, what we were working out. It did help us. Thirdly, the CCA data that we got onto the portal helped us identifying the performance level or the learning levels of students in critical years. For instance, those who are moving from 5th to 6th class or those who are moving from 9th to 10th class. And we were able to do summer remediation program of 2 months for such students, which again we measured their baseline and endline. So we were really identifying systemic level diagnostics and systemic level solutions at scale. But I think I totally agree with what Ben says about pedagogy level, at classroom level. And I think that's where we were actually heading to. We were developing, designing something that would actually help us, because as you know, most of the administrators are doing day-to-day management. Even when they go to schools for monitoring, as you're all aware, they would probably ask on midday meal or on toilets not being maintained or on teacher absenteeism, these kind of things. But or probably ask a couple of questions in the classroom, but not really record, measure, track over a period of time, coach and mentor the teachers. I think that is absolutely where we need to head further down. But these basic systems in place are also very critical for addressing on-scale learning outcomes gaps that we're finding. Coming to governance, what we found is that, again, drawing from my experience, having an integrated school information system really helped us in many ways. Earlier, as you are aware, Abhijit and maybe Ben also, our UDIs collected majorly child info as one silo and the school information as one silo. So while the school information may tell you 30 students are there, probably the child info will tell you some demographic details of child background and age and those kind of specifics. But these two data never joined together. And I think that's where Andhra Pradesh took the initiative in 2015, 16, and 16, 17 to link this through Aadhaar seeding. And that really enormously helped us in many ways. One, it threw out almost 5.5 lakh students who are registered enrolled both in government schools and private schools. And we could identify them through field verification, through actually where exactly they're studying, a private school or government school. In governance systems, this data was very helpful in also kind of optimizing our resources. And that particular year, I remember, I think around 100 crores was less budget spent on midday meal. Almost 26 crores was spent less on printing books for public schools, textbooks for public schools. So these are important initiatives. But more than that, this Aadhaar-based real-time teacher attendance, what we call e-hazard, was actually it actually helped us find out that honestly, teacher absenteeism was not such a major issue. There is a lot of public perception that almost 20% of teachers don't attend schools, they don't conduct classes, they're involved in so many other multifarious activities, which is true, but the absenteeism was not at that scale. Now we found it was something between 5 to 8% in most of the schools. But what helped is it built community confidence in government schools. And when they actually saw the teacher coming real time giving attendance, and that reflecting on the Chief Minister's core dashboard, overall attendance in schools in remotest parts has improved. And this helped the teacher engage more in classroom activities. And that was one governance result. Third one was that we actually tried building a performance-based teacher transfer system. Basically, we looked at data of class 10 performance, which is objectively verifiable. Teacher performance based on students' performance in class 10 with teacher attendance, with enrollment, which is again whatever the best quality available enrollment data for the school, actual students enrolled and their data confirmed by Aadhaar seeding, all this, which actually alerted teachers that yes, they have to concentrate on improving the learning levels of students, and that in turn will have impact on their transfers, which will in turn means that they can go to a place of their choice. So it was a bit complex, but it was completely transparent, online, choice-based, and there were no usual glitches or gaps that you notice in a kind of offline teacher transfer system. So that also again builds the confidence of teachers. In that way, governance systems could be improved. Then convergence with other departments. We manage around 45,000 schools in Andhra Pradesh. And for these, everyday midday meal organizing is a huge exercise. Supplies going on time is a huge exercise. We linked it up with the civil supplies department, mapped the schools to the ration shops, and so it was very smoothly. The supply system, indenting system has worked. And it cleaned up the system a lot. And more interestingly, we had this the transparency in facilitating private schools at about 15,000 private schools in applying for recognition or renewal or additional classrooms. So we put all these online and tracking with their basic demographic and other data being available in UDICE. They did not need to provide again a whole lot of data was not required, or even rationalizing schools, and we could make convincing argument with the Chief Minister's office and with the local public representatives. Almost 6,000 schools could be rationalized or merged with the neighboring schools. All again data supported. I mean, these kind of decisions, rational decisions could be taken to improve governance based on data utilization. So that's how I see practically there is a lot of support that data, right data, quality data provides for both driving learning outcomes as well as for improving governance. But the concerns and the issues pointed out by Ben and Abhijit, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And we need to make continuous efforts on that score.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your comments. I'll quickly address one question to Ben. Ben, you heard a lot of concern from both Abhijit and Sandhya ma'am on just the quality of data, right? Like, how do you trust what's coming through? Is there any input on that from your side? Like, anything that you saw or noticed?
Yeah, I suppose the question is, how much do you care about how precise the data is for the purposes I'm talking about? So in the case we're talking about where the coach is observing the teacher, they're kind of analyzing how skilled the teacher was in implementing, and then they're assessing 3 to 5 kids. We don't get a lot of cheating by the mentor to improve, to kind of increase the outcomes of the kids. I would say they inflate their scores a little bit. Like when our team does the analysis versus the government mentors does the analysis, it's probably a 10% range where the government mentors are a little bit higher. But, 55 versus 50, it's making the same point. Now, this is not the case. You couldn't be that lackadaisical about precision when it comes to questions like examinations and transfers into the next levels and access to secondary school. But for the purpose of determining whether or not the program is being implemented, we're not that concerned about precision. Now, there are other data systems that we're helping government on that are spending much more time on kind of the quality aspects and making sure you're quite rigorous. But for this purpose, we actually try and de-emphasize precision of the student assessment results so we can focus more time on the conversation and feedback between the coach and the teacher. The most important mechanism of the things I discussed is that kind of classroom observation, student assessment, but the really important thing is the conversation after that between the coach and the teacher, talking about implementation of the quality FLN program, and the discussion about how, the message that gets that the prime minister and the state leaders and the district leaders actually really care about your implementation in this rural school. That gives. I think that's a much more important thing. And actually, in some of our programs that have emphasized more on the data and the precision of that classroom assessment, you actually spend less time on the quality conversation about the pedagogical methods. And I think we've actually decided to go back to let's de-emphasize exactly whether this is a 50 or 55 and increase the emphasis on the classroom focus and pedagogical improvement. Now, again, that is a very different purpose than what Abhijit is talking about with respect to, examinations that are determinative of quality between schools or quality of an individual child's access to education. But I think that the sort of method I'm talking about is really missing from a lot of systems and is really important for having large-scale improvement. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Any questions that anyone in the panel has for anyone else? We're quite almost out of time. At most, we have another couple of minutes.
I mean, if I could just add to what Ben said. So I entirely agree on this, right? I think the other bit that I would like to push back against is that we're also at risk for the standard system level assessments of getting too caught up in details of educational measurement, right? So there's a lot of people who insist that, you basically need to do IRT, all your tests need to hang together a particular way and be linked and scaled. And, so that's what I do for a living. And I also fundamentally believe that it's not absolutely essential for administrative reform. What you need to be able to do is figure out, can kids read? Can they do basic math? And do I trust information on that? So I would entirely agree with Ben. If the difference we're talking about is sort of the difference between 50 and 55, I don't think I fundamentally care for these large-scale, low-stakes assessments. I think the risk here is that we're seeing things different by a factor of 2. So in the official data, there is no learning crisis in India today, right? So that suddenly implies a completely different scale of non-response, right? If that was true, then I would rather work on health or social security or welfare, because really our education system would have been working. So I think that's the magnitude difference, but that doesn't mean that everything needs external consultants to do IRT and link and all of that.
Fair. Very fair.
I'll have one point to say. UDIs, all these kind of macro data are absolutely critical. Having a single source of across the country 1.5 million schools and around 9.6 million teachers on GER or transition or dropout, these are absolutely critical. But I think it's very important, particularly considering the state is a key player in this whole education scenario. And you need to build those capacities at the state level. And the administrators can concentrate on building the system capacity, support to the planners and administrators. But I think we need to have a lot of experts and probably NGOs to try the pilot initiatives and then scale them, and experts to actually tell us what the data is saying. Where is action required to be taken? How do you measure it? How do you use it for improving learning outcomes? And I think one needs to work in that kind of a frame. Since we all care for what happens to our children and where we want them to definitely come out of schools with right attitude, approach, and education and skills.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. I think that was a great note. I think we have to close. But thank you all for such a great discussion. We'll be putting up takeaways from this on social media, etc., sharing with you. And hopefully we can make this useful somewhere to somebody. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.